All right, I realized I didn't have enough time in class to run through this Spring Boot project thoroughly. And I got a couple of emails where folks are a bit confused on exactly what I'm looking for in the project. So let's start at the very beginning here and walk through the different components, and hopefully this translates into useful knowledge. Also on Discovery, I added a video which is an introduction to Git. It's the most basic foundational video I found on Git without a whole bunch of terminology that's going to introduce confusion. Okay, so let's walk through this Spring Boot project. In class, we covered pom.xml, which manages our dependencies. There's a handful of them in here, but let's walk through each one at a time. Spring Boot Starter Data JDBC. JDBC stands for the Java Database Connector. That is a driver that allows the Java application to talk to the MySQL database. And that database is running in Docker. The next one is Spring Boot Starter Web. What this one does is this launches a Tomcat web server inside of the Java process and allows our web browser, whether that's Chrome, Firefox, Safari, or otherwise, to connect to that address in class we called localhost :8080. The next dependency here is Spring Boot Starter Timeleaf. Timeleaf is a templating engine, and we'll dive into that in a little bit here. But this takes the HTML and allows us to pass in variablized attributes into the model. So in work with those in Timeleaf, and then it takes those variables and applies it into the template. The next one here is called Flyway. Flyway is a tool that lets you run database migrations over time. And then there's a specific MySQL implementation of Flyway. So there's Flyway Core, and then there's Flyway MySQL. And so that's the MySQL aware way of doing database modifications over time. Then we have the MySQL Connector J. This is the driver that Spring Data JDBC uses in order to talk to the database itself. So notice JDBC is just a Java database connector, but it's not specific to any particular database brand, if you will. So you could talk to a Microsoft MS SQL database, and you'd still need the connector that supports connecting to that database. If you had an Oracle database or Postgres, you'd use a different driver for that. Most of those drivers then expose a JDBC compatible interface that Spring Data JDBC can then interact with. All right, I have one additional one in here, which is Spring Boot Docker Compose. And then when we click the play button, that will automate the process of running Docker Compose up. Ideally, I may be missing some configurations in the application.yaml file. We'll ignore that for the moment, and I'll fix that in a future pull request. We have test containers in here as well. So Spring Boot Starter Test, actually let me start there. Spring Boot Starter Test allows us to run unit tests and integration tests in our code. Unit testing and integration testing is an essential best practice in the software industry, and the main concept you're going to want to understand with that is that if you make changes to your code over time, if you have unit tests in there, they will help validate that the changes you're making on a project don't break existing functionality elsewhere in your code for whatever's covered under test. Test containers allows starting up a temporary database each time we run unit tests without modifying or relying on a main database to be working. How that works, and we'll run through that, is that when you run your unit tests, you'll see test containers starts up an ephemeral, meaning temporary, database. It seeds the information from the migrations, and then once it's done with that process, then it executes the test for any test that's labeled a data JDBC test and relies on the, let's see here, test configuration. In here we have this database context right here that applies settings like the username, password, and various other attributes on what to connect to. JUnit Jupyter is the dependency for the version of test containers to be able to know how to run that. Org test containers is the database connectivity to be able to launch a MySQL container. Spring Boot Starter Validation allows us to do form validation. So that means we could say we want an email address to be a proper email address without having to write a regular expression test in a class file. This is provided for us by the Spring Boot team. WebJar's Locator. This here allows us to, in our Timeleaf web side of things, download files that can be served through the container, and then the specific one that we're downloading is the Bootstrap CSS framework, and that just gives us some styling. That's all of our dependencies for the application. It's actually kind of a small list in comparison to most real-world applications, because a lot of other ones will grow and you might have client code that connects to third parties or otherwise, but this is really the minimal set of dependencies you're going to see in most real-world applications. Okay, let's run through the actual unit test first, because I think that's an interesting test to run through. And what we have in here at the very top, and I'm going to shrink this down here and here, and I'm going to minimize this as well. In this test, we are testing a couple of things. We want to see if we can save this entry object using our repository into the database. This one here does basically the same thing that the save operation can do, but we want to make sure that we can find the object from the database once it's saved, and that the values were populated in a way that's not null. We could, for example, test that the name, for example, equals test user as well, if we really want to be sure that the database is correctly persisting the entire length of that column, for example. So if we had a column that was like too short and we saved it, while that would normally throw an exception from the database, there's a potential where you could have something that truncates cleanly in the database and you only have partial information stored. That'd be a problem, and you may want to validate that in your code. And then we have one final test here. And this one saves a user with the same email address twice. So the first time we save it, we expect that to pass. The second time it saves, though, with that same email, we're expecting that the database is going to throw us an execution exception here when we do that. So if I were to run through all of these tests here, let's take a look at this, and it's going to go somewhat quick here, but you'll notice that Spring is starting up a Docker connection here, and then it's going to attempt to connect to that Docker host. So if I were to open up the Docker dashboard here, what we should see, show only running containers, and this is the same problem I ran into earlier. So I'm going to stop Docker. I'm going to quit it, and that should shut it down in a moment here. And now everything fails. So I probably need to reinstall Docker because mine's in like this weird state. So, okay, so it's only showing that. I'm going to click rerun again, and this time it should be talking to Docker properly. And now we can see this launched a MySQL 8 container. It was last started 0 seconds ago. And that went really quick. But let's go down through here. So it connected to Docker, and then it's going to launch the actual container. So we have this, it got to bootstrapping the instance. And then as we go further down here, there's a whole bunch of auto wiring stuff that happens in Spring. And then let's see here. We can see that, let me search for Flyway because it might be actually migration. There we go. Okay, so I had to scroll down a little bit here, not too far. Actually, it's like right at the top. So first things first, it launched the database, and then it executed this dbinit.sql. And let's take a look at that. dbinit.sql, right in here, creates the user if it doesn't already exist for this test account, and then we granted all privileges on here. something that I found with the MySQL container and how that connects with a Spring application is if you need to alter a database or you need to do anything special in there, sometimes you can run into permission issues. So it's just easier if you grant everything to the test user by the init process when it launches. So that's something we got going on in there. And then let's me find our migrations. So that's the next bit in here. So if we were to take a look at our resources, DB migrations, and I'm going to search for entries. Let's see here. Entries. This may not show that executed migrations in here. And I think it's already, I need to increase the logging level for Flyway to display the migrations that are executed. But we can create a bad migration here. I'm going to just delete this comma so we have some bad SQL in here. And if I were to rerun this test in here, we will get a new error, which is a good one here. So this is where you might have a migration that failed validation, and it will say there's a problem here. In this case here, there's a migration mismatch because it was already previously ran. So, and because we're allowing our containers to be reused, the database is already initialized and we have a version mismatch. So I'm just going to toss that container and we'll rerun in a clean state. We'll get a different error again. Let's see how happy it is. Right here. Perfect. Yep, we got a new error. And this time, this is the error that I was expecting to happen on here, which is saying that there's an error in this statement here. And it's up to me to figure out exactly what that error is. So typically what I would do if I was actually debugging this is I might copy this statement here, and then I might try to run it directly on a database. I'm going to fix that though, because I want this to pass. And now what do we have here? Oh, yes. Because it tried to run the migration and it failed, it's going to be in a problematic state. This is also something you'll encounter when you're working with Flyway migrations. And because this is a test one, actually, the solution for all this, let's fix that in here. I believe that's in the right here, where we're going to say reuse is false here and reuse is false here. This is a little bit slower. But is there anywhere else? I think that's the only spot where we say reuse is those two spots. So if I were to rerun this now, and I'll commit and change this up just so it's a little bit easier for everyone. You're not having to fight this every time you run your unit tests. It should run, and it's going to take a little bit longer because it starts it up every time. So I'm just going to commit and push this up just so if you pull down the changes, use the containers. Unit tests. Okay, so we're going to commit and push that up. And that will make sure that every time you run your tests and you modify your migrations, or you add a new migration, that it will succeed. Okay. Let's run through the code because in this project, what I said in that requirement was we need to add some new columns in here. And I want to walk through this so everyone has a chance to really just absorb the information. So if I were to run this project here in its current state, I'm just going to launch it with the debugger there. You could launch it the other way. And if I were to pull up the website here and were to create our entry, the context here that I want to show is that if you have a form here and you want to save information in the database, right now we're only capturing 2 fields on here from the end user. So we want to capture some additional information in here from a new user. So let's walk through adding a new column into the database. And what I'm going to call this one is favorite color. I'm going to use an underscore in there. And this one also can be a varchar. Now, if you were to think about a database with existing information in there, if you said that this was not null and you added this new column in here and you had existing fields in the database, so if we were to take a look at this right now, I think I have no, do I have no entries? Yeah, I have no entries in here. It wouldn't be a problem if we added in this additional favorite color column. That would be perfectly fine. However, if there's entries in there, and then we say you can't have a null value in here, and it tries to create the column, it's going to fail because entries don't exist without a value specified. So there's this concept here of default null. So if you wanted to provide a default value, you could do so. But in this case here, we're just going to say it's a nullable column. So the first thing first is I'm adding this new column, favorite color, default null. And that's one way to do it. But the problem here is we don't actually want to modify this file. Do you remember how we had that version mismatch problem in Flyway? So instead, what we want to do is we need to learn a new command here, and that's the alter statement. So I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to paste it, and I'm going to call this number 2. This is currently organized in year, month, day, and then with a whole bunch of spaces to allow for multiple migrations. And we're going to we could call this entries, or we could, call this new column right here, .SQL. And now we have the possibility to say alter table entries. And we're going to say this is our new column here. And you can see that AI here is auto-suggesting things in here in my IDE. Yours may or may not do that, just depending. But in this case here, so we're going to modify our entries column. And then we're going to add that favorite color. Add column favorite color varchar 50, not null. And if we're to run through our tests and run them, I believe everything should succeed because it's a... Oh, no, actually it won't because it says not null right here. This is going to fail because it's a not null column. And what's the error here? It's probably going to say failed to execute, blah, 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 blah. Why is that? Scroll down a little further. Field favorite color doesn't have a default value. Okay, well, let's modify this migration and allow it to be nullable. And if we run this test set again, it should work. So this is going to be a pretty typical development workflow. They call it red-green refactor, which is where you have failing unit tests, you make them green, and then you clean up your code and make it run a little bit better. So we have a new column in the database, and I haven't yet ran my application here. And what I'm going to do here, because I did this in class for a little bit, I'm going to do docker compose, actually I think it's docker space compose, down -v. This command right here, docker compose down -v, will take down our MySQL container. -v means it will delete the data volume in there. So it deletes all the data inside of that database itself. So if I run docker compose up now, and I'm going to refresh my database here, you'll see we don't actually have anything in it. It's just an empty schema right here which says NU. And now, because our unit tests pass, I'm feeling pretty good about that. I will rerun this application, and what you'll see in here is it starts up, and then you can see right in here, our DB migrate says it migrated the first one, created our entries table, and then we have a new version here that ran new column. If we were to take a look at this and refresh this, we now see 2 tables. Our Flyway schema, let's open up that real quick. And in here, what you see is our first one. That corresponds to that version over there. You could also just call this version 1, version 2, version 3, whatever you want to. It doesn't really matter as long as it's sequential and it follows the convention. There's like a certain number of underscores that the file likes. You can see the script it executed here. There's a checksum that's created. So in computer science terms, Flyway will take the textual content of this file and run it through a hashing algorithm, and then it outputs a number. So that's what that column checksum means. So whenever you make a modification to a migration, like where I added that space or a comma, that's why it broke, because it changed the checksum of that. And Flyway is not intelligent enough to know what changes you made. And so then it goes, human, please fix me. Then we have our next one here. Same migration here. And then this is our execution time in milliseconds, I believe. And then whether or not it succeeded or not. If you have a failed migration in production, you're going to have to delete a row right in here and potentially fix whatever modifications you made to the database schema in there. So that's that DDL changes. So if you think of flyweight, it's managing the sequence of DDL changes through. Okay, so let's go into the thing that we're going to consider. Actually, let's modify our entry cost. That's going to be the first thing. So we added a new column to the database. Great. And that new column was called favorite underscore color. But if we take a look at our form here, if I were to refresh this, I don't have favorite color listed in here. And if I were to create a new entry in here, test 3, and I call this test at example.com, because it's all clean, I have that saved. Great. And if I were to look at the data in here, you can see we have name, test 3, email, testexample.com, created at was managed automatically by the database, and the ID is automatically managed by the database here. But favorite color is set to null. Now, that's okay. It's an unknown value, but we didn't get the new information in that our hypothetical marketing department asked for. So we need to collect that favorite color. So first things first, let's add that new value in here. So I'm just going to call this private string favorite color. Sometimes there's a convention in here that if there's, actually I'm just going to store that right there like that, and I'll just call it favorite color. So we'll be really explicit here and define the exact mapping of this here, where you notice we have a capital letter C here, whereas in the database we have an underscore and lowercase. Different teams will have different naming conventions around how they like to do things. And so this is just the convention I'm using right now. Underscores separating words in the database, capital letters separating words in the programming language. I'm also going to add some new getters and setters. On the Mac, I'm hitting, I believe it's Control Enter on my keyboard, and I get this option here, and I'm just going to say getter and setter, favorite color. We're going to add that in here. And now we can have access to that information. If I add additional validation on this column, so if we were to rerun this application now, and then I believe that should be rebooting, yep, right now. If I were to resubmit this, I'm going to call this test 4, and the email we'll use is test 4 and submit it. That's all good. However, if we want to validate this, so we want to say at not empty. And then maybe we can add some size constraints around this. Minimum 3, max 20. I'm sure there's some colors that are longer numbers than that, possibly. But 3 seems pretty short. I'm not sure if there's any other colors shorter than the word red, so we'll go with that. And rerun this again. So we've added the now new field to the entity. So let's go back here, refresh this, but there's nothing new in here. Interesting. And I'll call this test 5 or test 54. That's fine here. Test 50 at example.com. And if we save it, interesting. It was happy. Did it actually save it though? That seems weird. Why did it do it? Oh, look at that. Test 54 didn't save, and we didn't get any errors. Huh. I wonder why. All right, well, we can take a look at our controller here. We have our binding result on the get mapping and the post mapping. And if there are errors, we just return the form. Okay. And if we were to take a look at that form template, which is source menu resources templates, and we have the entry form right here. I called it form.html. If there's any global errors, you know what we're going to do? Let's actually take a look at this, because this is kind of odd behavior, and we're not sure why. So I'm going to throw a breakpoint on here, which just means I click right here. And because I'm in the debugger, I can rerun this, and I can click save. And I landed within this area that I expected, because we saw it didn't get to saving, and it did return the form. And now we can take a look at the values of these different objects that exist within this scope. And there is an error. Favorite color must not be empty. Okay. So we have this errors binding result. And let's try to add in that side of things. I think we have it just called field global errors. Let's add one more in here. Let me think about this here, because there's specific, these are field level errors that we're not catching in here. And I'm kind of curious about this. So if fields has errors, seems promising. THH field errors. I'm curious if we can even get that. Let's see. So we're going to reload this with this just general set of errors. I'm not sure if that's going to work without a string. Normally you'd need a string there, but let's see what we got here. And we're going to go past this breakpoint. And okay, there we go. So we did get an error that says must not be empty. We don't know what field it is, but that is the correct error now displaying. So okay, that feels pretty good. I'm going to get rid of this bit though, because I don't think that's all that helpful. What we will do instead, we'll just say, instead of for each of those errors in echo out the error message, we will instead just add some plain text in here, and we can just say P paragraph, there was an error. That way what's going to happen is at the top, someone will know, generally speaking, what happens. I'm going to get rid of that breakpoint because it's not that helpful anymore. And now we get, there was an error. We don't know what the error was, and that's because we don't have a field reporting it. So let's go back to our form, and then let's add in our favorite color input. And this one we're going to just call this favorite color. The ID, this has to be unique because it's HTML, but favorite color. And then there's this star symbol, which in timely means it's referencing this object. It's like a field within that object. And the ID should provide type hinting on there. And then the one other spot here, we need to fix that. That needs to match the name of the object. So let's reload that there. And hopefully that's all done. Looks good. It'll probably be there by the time. And I'm going to resubmit this. And there we go. So now we've added a new column in here. It has validation. And our favorite color today is going to be blue. Actually, no, you know what? I'm just going to say B because I want it to fail with the minimum validation. That also gave us an error. So now we can say blue right here. And we'll submit that. And we didn't get any output on this one here. So that column's missing there. But let's take a look at our database. And what we can see is now the value populated. Feels good. And so let's just fix this entry response here. That should be pretty straightforward. We just got to find our template here. I believe that's just entry right here. And we can say TD. That's just a new column in here. And by default, it just suggested that right here. I'm going to reload it because we made a change to the HTML. And I don't have all the Spring Dev Tools fast reloading stuff. That's just adding more complexity for the moment. And so we'll refresh that. And now we can see blue here, but I forgot a title because, you know, and favorite color. Nothing fancy here. Reload again. Okay. That represents the first part of this assignment. We added a new column. You're going to want to add a couple of them on your side of things. But that's the end-to-end flow of making modifications to an entity in a web application. We modified the template, we modified the entity, and we modified the actual database structure with a new flyway migration and executing an alter statement. There's kind of a bonus section in here, and which is that let's add on our list of entries in the database. And so I'm going to add a new tidbit here to our get mapping on the index page here. And this is the tricky bit here. So we're going to add, we need to add our model. This is the Spring UI model, so you don't need any new imports for that to happen because it's already used down here. And then what we're going to say is right here. The IDE actually already auto-suggests it for me, probably because it knows what I like to do. And we're leveraging the find all method right here. So now this is going to, I'm going to actually just throw a breakpoint on here, refresh this, and let's take a look at what happens when it calls find all. And we've got this model attribute. So I'm going to go to the home page, right here. We got the breakpoint, we hit the breakpoint, and if we go take a look at our entries, we see entries, and it has a list, an array list type here containing each one of these entry objects. Cool, sounds good. So now let's run through that, and let's do a new row, and let's create a table. We'll leverage the class table for styling purposes, and maybe we'll do table striped just for the fun of it. Okay, in HTML, you have a header and you have a body. So we'll do thead, tr, th, ID, name. Maybe that's all we want to display on there. We could display it all, but we don't have to. Tbody, tr, td. Okay, so this is where things get a little interesting. So we have a template. We know we want to go over each one of those entries. So th:/each, that's the syntax for that. And I'll just call this entry, colon, and then you get this dollar symbol, and then we'll just say entries. So this is now going to create a new row, and it's going to provide this new variable entry in here, going over each of those entries that was passed from the controller right here, which got all of the entries from the repository. Okay, sounds good so far. And now we want to provide some text. And this is $entry dot get ID. And then in here, a cool thing about Timeleaf, one of the main concepts of it is ID goes here. Is the th text is going to replace this ID goes here tidbit, and I'll do the same thing here. Entry get name goes here. So if I were to preview just what this template looks like, the whole like kind of idea, there we go. This is what it would look like if you were to not have any values go in. So you can kind of look at this layout and be like, that looks about right. It's a table and it has the information in there. So far so good. I'm going to reload this page now that we have our entries. And let's see what we got over here. So I'm going to go up here and reload it. I'm going to remove that breakpoint because I don't care, and I'm going to click the play button just to resume everything. And here we go. Now we have our whole index list of all the entries in the database, rendered in a way that's visually useful. Let's go one step further, because now I kind of want to be able to click onto this and see some additional information, like the favorite color of the people, or perhaps their email address. So let's add that one additional attribute. And I'm going to take a look at this index controller, and we have this get mapping entries/ID. So manually, if I were to go to entries/3, I end up on test 54. Let's add a hyperlink, maybe over here on the 3 side of things. So we'll be fancy here, and we'll go to our index. And I'm going to cut out I'm going to cut out this value being pasted here. And let's add an anchor. th/href equals, and those are things get a little different. There's an @ symbol, entries/plus, and then I'm going to say entry.getID here. And then in here, we'll paste that th text value in there. And then I'm going to close that anchor tag. And if I were to reload this now, what am I missing here? I close that. Okay, there's a missing curly brace in there. And okay, let's reload this. This should be happy. We should get a link in here. And once it loads, do we get a link? Anchor. ID goes here. th/href. Let me reload again, just in case I... Let's inspect the source. What's going on here? Oh, I have a typo. th/ref. There we go. That HTML attribute was wrong. Okay, let's reload this. And we got links now. We can go to 1. Cool, looks good. We can go to 2. And notice how these values here are being interpolated and replaced. And so that is the context of kind of the how-to on this assignment. I really wanted to make sure that everyone had a walkthrough of what needs to happen. and just get a feel for what those change sequences are. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to check out a different branch, and that way you can look at all the files that I modified in this branch in order to be able to see what those are just in your own editor or on GitHub. Good luck!